You see her in the half-light, standing beneath the arch of a ruined temple. Her dark eyes burn with something primal, something cruel. "I know who sent you," she says, her voice dripping with venom. "Another prophet, no doubt, to call me to repentance." You freeze. Her smile is sharp, predatory. "I've dealt with your kind before," she continues, stepping closer, her movements as graceful as they are deadly. "And I'll deal with you the same way." Her hand brushes a dagger at her hip, but she doesn't draw it, not yet. She wants you to feel the weight of her hatred, the inevitability of what's coming. "Run back to your God," she whispers, her voice soft but lethal. "If you're fast enough, maybe you'll live to warn the others." She turns, disappearing into the shadows. But you know she isn't retreating. She's hunting. Hello and welcome back to Ladies of Lore, the podcast where we take the most amazing and fascinating women of mythology and folklore from all over the world and we do a bit of unpicking. We find out all about where they came from and where they are today. I'm India and I am so grateful to have you here with me today. If you are new to the podcast, hello, and a big thank you for giving it a listen. I really hope you enjoy it. And if you do, please do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and leave me a little comment. Let me know what you think. I love hearing from you guys. How is your January? Mine has been lovely so far. I had my wonderful friends over this past weekend for a bit of a friend's Christmas where we did a Secret Santa, and my Santa got me some adorable gifts, including some Ladies of Lore stickers with Spotify codes on them, which is just so cool. I'm just trying to think where I'm going to stick them. It's very exciting for me. And I did post some pictures of them over on my Blue Sky account, so if you do follow me, you might have seen it there. But thank you again, Katie, for the stickers and for all the gifts and just for being you. You are such a great friend and such a great support for the podcast. And you might also be wondering, why am I uploading on a Wednesday? And that's because from now I am changing the drop day for the podcast to a Wednesday. This is purely because it gives me an extra day of breathing space if I have weekend plans to get the podcast done. So it will mean I can be a lot more consistent for you guys, which is the most important thing. Now, enough about all of that. Let's move on to the main event. So today we're tackling one of the most infamous figures in history and religion, the bad girl of the Bible, Jezebel. Was she a villain or was she a victim? Was she an idol or an icon? Or maybe she was both. Her name resonates far beyond its biblical roots, and we're going to trace her story, unravel her many interpretations, and explore how she's been reimagined in our modern world. And thank you to Lauren over on Blue Sky who suggested this topic. Now, if you're ready, sit back, get comfortable, and prepare to meet Jezebel like never before. Jezebel is a prominent figure in biblical history, so you may very well know her as a Phoenician princess and later a queen of Israel. The Hebrew name Jezebel is usually translated to "Where is my prince?" or "exalted of Baal." And the Hebrew root word Zebel was probably changed or added because Zebel or Zebel actually means dung. which is a bit of an insult to Jezebel's character. We can find the very first reference to Jezebel in the Hebrew Bible, specifically in Book 1 Kings. This book belongs to the Deuteronomistic history, which is a collection of texts that includes Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1 and 2 Samuel, and 1 and 2 Kings. And these were most likely compiled and edited during the 7th and 6th centuries BCE. And this was a period associated with the religious reforms of King Josiah of around 640 to 609 BCE and the Babylonian exile around 586 BCE. And Jezebel's story, set in the 9th century BCE, was probably first preserved through oral traditions before finally being written down. And scholars suggest that the written accounts of her life and influence were composed during the Judahite monarchy or shortly afterwards, reflecting the concerns of later generations about idolatry and covenant fidelity. And we'll talk a bit more about that later, so don't worry. The final form of the Book of Kings, including the narrative about Jezebel, likely emerged during or after the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE, as part of a theological interpretation of Israel's history, emphasizing divine judgment and covenantal themes. So even before Jezebel was first mentioned in written texts, her story had changed through oral tradition and been influenced by the changing social and political landscape around her. So as I said, Jezebel is introduced in Book 1 Kings 1631, within the context of King Ahab's reign over the northern kingdom of Israel. And the text describes Ahab's marriage to Jezebel as a turning point that leads to the introduction of idolatrous practices in Israel. And this is what it says in 1 Kings 16:31. And it came to pass, as though it had been a trivial thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, that he took as wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and he went and served Baal and worshipped him. This verse is really interesting because it not only introduces Jezebel, but it also gives us a little bit of context and background information on her lineage. It establishes her as the daughter of Ethbaal, king of Tyre and Sidon, who also served as a priest of the goddess Astarte, a deity central to Phoenician religion. And Jezebel's marriage to this king of Israel was most likely a political alliance aimed at strengthening ties between Israel and the powerful maritime Phoenicians. But it would have been a bit of a scandalous marriage, because for most of the Hebrew Bible, any marriage outside of the Israelite tradition was very much discouraged, particularly if it was to a foreign woman, as women were characterized as deceivers, because of course we were. Upon becoming queen, Jezebel actively introduced and promoted the worship of Baal, who was a storm and fertility god, and the mother goddess Asherah, into the northern kingdom of Israel. And she went pretty far with pushing the worship for these deities, so she constructed temples and altars, and she supported a large retinue of prophets. And these actions brought her into direct conflict with the monotheistic worship of Yahweh, the national god of the ancient kingdom of Israel and Judah. And Jezebel's opposition to Yahweh's prophets was epitomized by her persecution and execution of many, which intensified religious tensions 100 million-fold. In fact, no time is wasted telling us anything about Jezebel's thoughts or her feelings about being married off for political gain, and the second mention of her is simply, Jezebel was killing off the prophets of the Lord. So she's not really given any kind of character development. She is simply an opposition to the Yahweh, and she's a prophet murderer. That is all we need to know. Now, with any villain, and Jezebel was certainly villainized, we've got to have a quote-unquote hero. And this comes in the form of her most prominent adversary, the prophet Elijah, who publicly challenged her promotion of idolatry and had several run-ins with Jezebel throughout her appearances in the Bible. And we'll find out more about Elijah when I tell you some stories about Jezebel, because he really is, he's the Voldemort to her Harry Potter. He is the Saruman to her Gandalf. He's just her nemesis. But it's clear to see that the Bible sets Jezebel up as a person who is a foreigner in a foreign land with a differing religion to her husband. And hopefully we all know enough about the way women are very often treated in mythology and folklore to have a bit of an idea of how things might go down after this. So let's jump into some of the most famous tales of Jezebel to give you a better idea about how her life and ultimately her death played out.
We'll be right back.
You like weird stories? You like bizarre accounts? You like horror movies?
Come on down to Pumpkin Hill Radio for all your paranormal, metaphysical, and high strangeness needs. Every Tuesday with hosts Travis, that's me, and Dawson.
It's me. Have you ever seen something you can't explain? Have you ever felt something you can't explain?
Do you have questions that nobody can answer?
Have you heard a story that made you feel completely mad?
Do you feel like you shouldn't Google what you just saw?
Have you tried to Google it and got nothing?
We might be able to help.
We're looking for it.
That's every Tuesday with hosts Travis and Dawson, Pumpkin Hill Radio. Come on down.
PHR, baby.
Pumpkin Hill Radio, available on all platforms. Anything else to say?
We'll see you there. Give it a follow. Tell your friends.
The story of Jezebel's campaign against the prophets of Yahweh is one of the most harrowing episodes in Book 1 Kings, a tale of power, faith, and survival in a time of deep religious conflict. Her story unfolds during her time as queen, after marrying King Ahab and bringing Phoenician customs and Baal worship into the heart of Israel. Jezebel, a devoted follower of Baal and Asherah, was no ordinary queen. She wielded power with an iron will and sought to reshape Israel's religious identity, replacing its worship of Yahweh, the God of Israel, with the polytheistic practices of her homeland. Now, to achieve this, Jezebel initiated an aggressive and violent campaign against Yahweh's prophets, aiming to silence any voice that opposed her religious agenda. This wasn't merely a passive attempt to shift religious practice, it was an all-out war against Yahweh's followers. The Bible tells that Jezebel ordered the execution of many prophets of Yahweh. This wave of persecution swept throughout the land, creating an atmosphere of fear and despair among those faithful to Yahweh. Despite the danger, some prophets managed to survive, mostly thanks to the actions of Obadiah, who was a high-ranking official in King Ahab's court. Obadiah was a devout believer in Yahweh. Even while serving under a regime hostile to his faith, he maintained his loyalty to Yahweh. Risking his life, he secretly hid 100 prophets in 2 caves, 50 per cave, and provided them with food and water. This act of defiance against Jezebel's decree was a testament to the resilience of Yahweh's followers in the face of this tyrannical woman. And during this time, Elijah, who I mentioned earlier, who was the most prominent prophet of Yahweh, remained a massive pain in Jezebel's arse. He was her nemesis, like I said earlier, and while many prophets were silenced, Elijah continued to speak out against the idolatry and corruption that Jezebel and Ahab had brought to Israel. And his defiance made him a key target for Jezebel. Yet, despite her efforts, Elijah eluded capture every single time and continued to challenge her authority time and time again, and eventually became a bit of a symbol of resistance against Baal worship. And the tension reached its breaking point when Elijah confronted Ahab and accused him of abandoning Yahweh's command and leading Israel into idolatry under Jezebel's influence. And this confrontation set the stage for the scandalous and dramatic showdown on Mount Carmel, which I will tell you about in just a sec. And Jezebel's campaign against these prophets was not just to gain political control, but it was a deeply personal crusade to establish her religious beliefs as supreme in Israel. And it highlighted her determination and her ruthlessness, as well as the resilience of those who remained faithful to Yahweh. So they were two extremely devoted and extremely passionate sides to the coin here. So what happened at Mount Carmel that was so dramatic? So the northern kingdom of Israel at this point is in chaos. The once devout nation has become a hotbed of idol worship thanks to King Ahab and his Phoenician queen, our girl Jezebel. And she's introduced Baal worship with all its pomp and pageantry, and the people, they're eating it up, or they're at least pretending to, just to keep themselves safe. And Jezebel feels like she's finally maybe turning a bit of a corner and getting the people on her side. But at this point, enter Elisha, the lone prophet of Yahweh, who is completely over this at this point. He's had it up to here, and he's ready to prove that Yahweh is the one true God, and all of these idols that she's trying to bring to the land are a load of rubbish. And Elijah is no stranger to King Ahab. They know each other. Elijah has been telling Ahab for years that he is turning away from Yahweh and denounced him publicly several times for this. And to make everything worse, there's also a famine in the land, which, according to Elijah, is a divine punishment for Israel's idolatry. So the people are starving, and the tensions are high and only getting higher. Meanwhile, Jezebel's prophets of Baal, they're living it large. They have royal sponsorship and extravagant rituals, and they're not feeling the impact of this famine at all. And this kind of all bubbles up, and Elijah, well and truly, he's had enough, and he decides that it's time for a showdown. So he marches up to Ahab and essentially says, "Enough is enough. Let's settle this once and for all. Gather your 450 prophets of Baal, plus the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table, and meet me on Mount Carmel. We're going to find out whose God is real." The entire nation turns out for this showdown. Commoners, nobles, everyone. Mount Carmel becomes a stage for the ultimate divine smackdown. Elijah, with a bit of dramatic flair, steps forward and calls out to the people, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If Yahweh is God, follow him. If Baal is God, follow him." The people? Dead silent. Crickets. You could hear a pin drop. And then Elijah goes on to lay down the rules of this game. Here's how it's going to go. We'll each prepare a bull for sacrifice, and we'll place it on a plinth of wood. But we will not light the fire. Instead, we'll call upon our gods to send fire down from the heavens. And the God who answers with fire, well, he's the real deal. Everyone agrees to these terms, and the prophets of Baal go first. And they prepare their bull, and they set it on the altar, and they start to call on Baal. They chant, "Oh Baal, answer us." Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Undeterred, they start to dance around the altar, shouting louder and louder, but there's still no fire. Hours pass, the sun climbs higher in the sky, and Elijah starts to heckle them. "Shout louder," he taunts. "Maybe your God is deep in thought, or busy, or travelling, or perhaps he's asleep and he needs to be woken up." And the original Hebrew, it even hints that Elijah might have suggested that Baal was in the restroom. Which, we love to see a little toilet humour in the Bible. But at this point, the prophets, they're pretty desperate. And in their desperation, they begin to slash themselves with swords and spears, spilling their own blood in a bid to provoke Baal. By the evening, they're exhausted, they're bloody, and they're a bit humiliated. Baal has well and truly ghosted them. And now it's Elijah's turn, and he's not about to let this moment go to waste. He calls the people closer and calmly repairs the altar of Yahweh, using 12 stones to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. Next, he digs a trench around the altar, arranges the wood, and places the bull on top. But he's not done yet. Elijah then orders water to be poured over the altar, not once, not twice, but 3 times until the trench is overflowing and the wood is thoroughly soaked. Fire? Seems like it might be a bit impossible at this point. But then Elijah steps back and prays. And it's not a long, showy prayer like the prophets of Baal had chanted all day. It's simple and heartfelt. Yahweh, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant. Answer me, so these people will know that you, Yahweh, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back to you. Before anyone can blink, fire falls from the sky like a lightning bolt. It consumes everything, the bull, the wood, the stones, even the water in the trench. The crowd is stunned. And then chaos erupts. People fall to the ground, shouting, Yahweh, he is God! Yahweh, he is God! And Elijah doesn't waste a moment. This man is a master at seizing his moment. And he takes the prophets of Baal and orders their execution in the Kishon Valley, putting an end to their influence in Israel. It's dramatic, and it's this bloody finale to an already shocking day. But Elijah, he's not done yet. He climbs to the top of Mount Carmel. He kneels down and prays for rain. And soon the skies, which had been dry for years, grow dark, and a torrential downpour begins. The famine is over. And word of this spectacular event reaches none other than Jezebel. And she, to put it lightly, is furious. If Elijah thought that this would scare her into submission, he was sorely mistaken, and she vows to kill him within 1 day and sends him fleeing into the wilderness. But for that brief moment on Mount Carmel, Elijah stands victorious, and Yahweh's power is pretty undeniable. And this story is the ultimate mix of drama, spectacle, and divine intervention. And it's proof that when it comes to showdowns, the Bible does know how to deliver. Jezebel's manipulation extended beyond religious affairs. In one particularly infamous episode, and actually the episode that ends in the prophecy of her death, her husband Ahab coveted a vineyard owned by a man named Naboth. And when Naboth refused to sell the land because it was part of his ancestral inheritance, Ahab sulked like a child. And Jezebel, she was completely unbothered by all of the moral and legal constraints, and she devised a plan to seize the vineyard for her husband. She forged letters in Ahab's name, falsely accusing Naboth of blasphemy and treason. Naboth was subsequently executed by stoning, and the vineyard was handed over to Ahab. And this act of injustice drew the immediate attention of, you guessed it, Elijah, who delivered a terrifying prophecy. The house of Ahab would be destroyed, and dogs would devour Jezebel's body by the wall of Jezreel. And true to Elijah's word, Ahab's dynasty began to crumble. Ahab himself died in battle against the Syrians, and his blood was licked up by dogs at the very place where Naboth had been executed. Jezebel, however, continued to exert her influence as Queen Mother after Ahab's death, and she ruled from behind the scenes for about 10 years. But her time was running out, and soon she too would be dead. And let me tell you, her death is an extremely bloody one. So here's how Jezebel met her end. Elisha, the successor of the prophet Elijah, anointed a military commander named Jehu. And by anointing him, Jehu was able to execute divine judgment. Now, this marked the beginning of the end for Jezebel, as Jehu launched a relentless campaign against Ahab's family, killing Ahab's sons before finally turning his attention to Jezebel, who was at the palace in Jezreel. Jezebel, even in her final moments, displayed her signature arrogance and defiance. Hearing that Jehu was approaching, she adorned herself with makeup, painting her eyes in a move that's often seen as suggestive and seductive, and she also put on fine clothing and positioned herself at a window in full splendour, possibly attempting intimidate or maybe even seduce Jehu. But Jehu was unmoved. He was on a mission and he would make sure that she met her end. And when he arrived, Jezebel taunted him. She shouted down from the window, "Is it peace, Zimri, murderer of your master?" Now, this quote can be taken in a few ways. It references an earlier coup of Zimri, who killed King Elah and all of the other claimants to the throne. So it could be that she's preempting what was about to happen, but another take on that is it may also be a curse meant to thwart the success of Jehu's insurrection. And this is because after Zimri killed King Elah, he only ruled for 1 week before he too became the victim of political violence. So although the beautiful makeup and the clothes could be seen as potentially Jezebel trying to seduce Jehu, her words didn't really match that, and it seemed very much more like she was trying to intimidate him. She was not seducing him, she was mocking him or cursing him. And Jehu, underneath the window, asked who was on his side. And Jezebel's own eunuchs answered, and they betrayed her. They seized her and they threw her out of the window, and she hit the floor. And when she hit the floor, her blood splattered on the walls and on Jehu's horses, who then proceeded to trample all over her broken body. And Jehu was pretty unfazed by this, and to be honest with you, he'd been killing people all day and he'd worked up a bit of an appetite. So he just went inside to eat and drink. And a few hours later, after he'd had his fill of food, he suddenly remembered that Jezebel's body was outside and he probably ought to do something about it. So he ordered for her body to be buried. But it was too late. Dogs had already devoured most of her body, leaving only the palms of her hands, her skull, and her feet. And this gruesome scene fulfilled Elijah's prophecy to the letter. And Jezebel's body was left unburied, desecrated, as a sign of divine judgment. And what's a bit interesting to note here is that dogs are actually a powerful symbol in Canaanite religions and are particularly associated with the god Baal, the very same god that Jezebel had devoted herself to. So in the words of the great Alanis Morissette, isn't it ironic? Jezebel's story is a powerful reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition, moral corruption, and defiance against God. Her life was marked by a relentless pursuit of power at any cost, and her death served as a stark example of how divine justice cannot be evaded. This narrative, preserved in the books 1-2 Kings, continues to resonate as a cautionary tale of pride in the face of ultimate authority. And I'm sure it's not lost on any of you just how negatively Jezebel has been portrayed throughout the stories that I've just told you. And I think it'd be a bit amiss not to unpack that a little bit. So firstly, we can look at it through a religious lens. Jezebel's most significant offence, according to the biblical narrative, was her active promotion of Baal worship in Israel, which directly opposed the worship of Yahweh. And Jezebel brought her religious practices into the northern kingdom and sought to supplant Yahwehism with her polytheistic beliefs. She built temples, she supported prophets of Baal and Asherah, and she persecuted Yahweh's prophets, actions that were viewed as a grave threat to the covenantal relationship between Israel and Yahweh. So for biblical authors who were deeply committed to the idea of monotheism, Jezebel represented everything that threatened the purity and survival of Israel's faith. So by depicting her as a villain, they helped to reinforce the dangers of idolatry and apostasy. And then we've got the issue of politics. So Jezebel's political escapades, such as orchestrating the death of Naboth just to seize a vineyard, exemplify this cunning and ruthlessness that seems to shine through in every tale about her. And the biblical authors highlighted these to help portray her as a symbol of injustice and abuse of power. Her willingness to exploit legal and religious systems for personal and political gain likely fueled her negative portrayal. And by presenting her as the driving force behind these immoral actions, the Bible frames her as a corrupting influence on Ahab and, by extension, the nation of Israel, again reinforcing the dangers of idolatry and of those who practice it. And then we've got the main fact, which is that she's a woman. In a patriarchal society like ancient Israel, women who wielded significant power, particularly in ways that defied traditional gender roles, were often viewed with suspicion and hostility. And Jezebel's active role in politics and her influence over King Ahab, and her leadership promoting Baal, challenged this male-dominated social norm of the time. And the biblical authors might have cast her as a dangerous and subversive figure, partly because she defied these expectations, using her power to advance an agenda that they deemed destructive. And Jezebel's character was likely exaggerated and vilified to serve as a literary and theological symbol of rebellion against Yahweh. The biblical narrative often uses individuals to embody sort of a broader spiritual or moral principle. In this case, Jezebel came to represent the ultimate antagonist to Yahwehism, a figure who not only rejected Yahweh, but actively worked to eradicate his worship. Her name became synonymous with idolatry and apostasy, reinforcing the theological message that disobedience to Yahweh leads to downfall and divine judgment. Even after her death, Jezebel's legacy continued to serve as a warning. Her violent and humiliating death, prophesied by Elijah and fulfilled in 2 Kings, reinforced this idea of divine justice. And in the New Testament, Jezebel is mentioned again in Revelation 2:20, when her name is used as a metaphor for false prophecy and seduction into idolatry. And this again further solidifies her reputation as a symbol of evil and rebellion. The authors of the Deuteronomistic history, which includes 1 and 2 Kings, likely wrote from a perspective that sought to explain the downfall of Israel and Judah as a result of covenant unfaithfulness. And Jezebel's story was a perfect way to help to do this. And while her actions were undoubtedly antagonistic to the biblical worldview, her character has also been shaped and amplified by cultural and editorial biases of the time. So Jezebel's vilification ensured that her name would endure as a cautionary symbol. But modern interpretation suggests that her story also reflects the complexities of power, gender, and cultural conflict in ancient Israel. So let's move on and see how interpretations of Jezebel have changed over time. It shouldn't be too surprising to know that the story of Jezebel has undergone significant reinterpretations over time, shaped by theological, cultural, and feminist perspectives. The versions I've just told you from 1 and 2 Kings portray her as a manipulative and idolatrous queen. But Jezebel's character has become a focal point for broader debates on gender, power, and morality in lots of different historical contexts. So in the early Christian tradition, Jezebel's image was further solidified as a symbol of wickedness and heresy. For instance, the book of Revelation refers to a Jezebel who leads others into immorality, reinforcing her association with transgression and rebellion against divine authority. And this early interpretation positioned her as a cautionary figure once again, warning against the dangers of female authority and independence within religious communities. And come the Middle Ages, Jezebel's character was increasingly conflated with broader stereotypes of evil women. In theological and literary works, she was often used as this kind of moral exemplar of the consequences of sin, with her story being employed by preachers to reinforce traditional gender roles and warn against female pride, vanity, and disobedience. Medieval sermons quite often depicted her as this vain and overly sexualized figure. Do you remember what I told you earlier about her adorning herself with all of these beautiful clothes and makeups just before her death? Well, this was taken and used as an example of how morally decayed she was. People at the time saw these adornments as emblematic of moral corruption and associated the beauty with ideas of deceit and sin. And the church used this association to promote the idea that women should stay modest and avoid ostentatious displays of wealth or beauty, which were seen as tools of seduction and moral decline. And this was also reflected in art of the time, which often depicted Jezebel as a richly dressed woman with what can only be described as exaggerated features, emphasizing this role of temptress that they'd cast her in. And at this time, Jezebel represented the dangers of female sexuality and ambition. In the Speculum Humanae Salvationis, which was a widely read medieval text, Jezebel's death is portrayed once more as divine justice against a sinful and manipulative women. And the message was, those who oppose the will of God will meet a grisly end. The Renaissance period brought a bit of a new fascination with biblical stories, and although Jezebel was still a symbol of vice, this newfound interest in the dynamics of power and gender did have somewhat of an influence on how she was interpreted. She was often invoked in literary works that sought to critique powerful or overreacting women. We're always overreacting, aren't we? My lord. And she became a bit of a touchstone for discussing the dangers of female political agency. For instance, Protestant reformers like John Knox explicitly drew on the imagery of Jezebel to attack figures such as Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, John Knox had a very infamous pamphlet which was called First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regimen of Women, which is a bit of a mouthful. I think he could have thought of a better name for it, but in this pamphlet, Knox used Jezebel as a biblical parallel for what he saw as the unnatural and dangerous reign of women over men. And my goodness, do I recommend going to have a read of this pamphlet. I'm going to put the link in the show notes so you can read it, but I will give you some of my favourite quotes from this pamphlet. How abominable before God is the empire or rule of wicked women, yea, of traitress and bastard. And my other favourite is, it is a thing most repugnant to nature that women rule and govern over men. It's a hoot to read. So I would definitely recommend you go down to the show notes and give it a whirl, give you a laugh. Jezebel's influence can also be felt in other literary works like Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, which has many allusions to biblical figures like Jezebel to help underscore these themes of hubris and divine retribution. And no, she's not directly referenced, but her influence can definitely be felt on this archetype of the powerful but morally ambiguous woman that became a recurring motif in Renaissance drama. So it's clear to see that across the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, Jezebel was still a figure used to push the agenda of the patriarchy and its values and morals. She was a tool, and the very fact that she needed to be employed in such a way is reflective of the broader cultural and religious anxieties about women, power, and transgression. She was a cautionary figure, and she was used to vilify women who defied societal norms. With the rise of feminism and gender studies in the 20th and 21st centuries, Jezebel's character underwent significant re-evaluation. Feminist theologians and scholars began to question the patriarchal biases inherent in her biblical portrayal, arguing that her vilification stemmed more from her defiance of traditional gender roles than her actual deeds. And they highlighted how Jezebel's political acumen, religious devotion to her gods, and assertive personality were reinterpreted as inherently threatening in a male-dominated society. And scholars like Phyllis Tribal in Texts of Terror, written in 1984, re-examined Jezebel's story as an example of how biblical narratives marginalised and demonised powerful women. And we've definitely seen that before on the podcast. Think about Lilith. Tribal argued that Jezebel's actions could be seen as those of a strong and capable leader, whose condemnation was rooted in cultural and religious biases rather than her inherent morality. Moreover, Jezebel's legacy has been appropriated in discussions of race and sexuality. In the context of American history, the term Jezebel became a racialized stereotype used to justify the hypersexualization and exploitation of black women, particularly during the era of slavery. And this interpretation drew from biblical imagery to portray black women as lascivious and morally corrupt, perpetuating harmful stereotypes that continue to have repercussions even today. Feminist scholars have critiqued this usage, emphasizing the need to dismantle such prejudices and reclaim Jezebel's story as a critique of patriarchal narratives. In contemporary feminist readings, Jezebel is increasingly seen as a symbol of resistance against oppressive structures. Her story has been reimagined in literature and art as one of empowerment rather than condemnation. For instance, some modern writers and artists have reinterpreted Jezebel as a figure who challenges male authority and asserts her agency, even in the face of systemic opposition. And these reinterpretations align with broader feminist efforts to recover the voices of marginalised women in history and scripture, transforming Jezebel from a symbol of evil into a complex and multi-dimensional character. And this evolution of Jezebel's interpretation reveals a lot about societal attitudes towards women, power, and morality. From her biblical portrayal as an idolatrous queen to her modern reclamation as a bit of a feminist icon, Jezebel's story underscores the ways in which narratives are shaped by cultural and ideological frameworks. Her character continues to inspire debate and reflection even today, and she challenges us to reconsider the biases that inform our understanding of history and religious figures. Jezebel has well and truly transcended her ancient roots to become somewhat of a multifaceted symbol in modern culture. She's frequently referenced across various forms of media, including TV, film, music, literature, feminism, and art. And I'm going to take you on a little whistle-stop tour of her influence and give you some examples of where you can find references to Jezebel today. First up, we'll have a little look at television. So Jezebel often appears in TV as a symbol of power, defiance, and moral ambiguity. Now, she's not always directly referenced, but we can absolutely see characters in some pretty big shows that definitely seem to draw influence from her stories. So take, for instance, the character of Cersei Lannister from Game of Thrones, both the TV series and the book. And Cersei is frequently likened to Jezebel due to this manipulative nature that she has, the use of seduction, and her perceived amorality. Like Jezebel, Cersei wields power unapologetically, challenging traditional and patriarchal roles. And I don't want to talk any more about Game of Thrones because it makes me angry. I don't know what they did to it, I don't know why they ruined it, but they ruined it. And we do also have some more direct references, probably the most notable in another book-to-TV series is The Handmaid's Tale, where the term Jezebels is directly used to describe a secretive brothel where women are objectified in Gilead's oppressive society. And this is actually pretty interesting because it starkly contrasts with Jezebel's biblical agency and highlights the ways patriarchal societies vilify women who defy social norms. And if you've seen The Handmaid's Tale, you'll know women are vilified pretty frequently. And moving on to music, we can find numerous songs influenced by Jezebel, and they typically symbolise danger, seduction, or rebellion. So the first song that I'll mention is Jezebel by Frankie Lane of 1951, and that song casts Jezebel as a dangerous temptress who leads men to ruin, and this kind of reinforces the traditional image as a femme fatale. And I won't read all of the lyrics for all of the songs, but the lyrics for this one are scathing, and it opens like this. If ever the devil was born without a pair of horns, it was you, Jezebel. It was you. Scathing, like I said. Not very nice. Slightly less scathing is the song Jezebel by Sadie in 1992, and this reimagines Jezebel as more of a tragic figure, a woman condemned by society for her independence and self-determination, and it offers a bit more of an empathetic portrayal. Here's some lyrics for that one. Jezebel, Jezebel, won't try to deny where she came from. You can see it in her pride and the raven in her eyes. And then there's the song, you guessed it, Jezebel by Iron and Wine from 2013. And this is a folk song. I don't know if any of you have listened to any Iron and Wine, but I think they were on the Twilight soundtrack. So if you're a Twilight girly like me, you will have heard some Iron and Wine. But this song reflects on a woman who seeks freedom and identity, challenging the judgment placed on her by societal norms. And it goes, who's seen Jezebel? She was born to be the woman I would know, and hold like a breeze half as tight as both eyes closed. And who's seen Jezebel? Jezebel's archetype also frequently appears in cinema, often in the form of a femme fatale or misunderstood rebel. The classic film Jezebel of 1938 stars Bette Davis as a headstrong Southern belle, Southern Jezebel, who, I make myself laugh, it's not funny, whose defiance of societal conventions leads to scandal. And the title directly invokes the biblical queen, though the character is ultimately redeemed through sacrifice. So she doesn't get killed and eaten by dogs. And then here's a bit of an interesting one. There's a little bit indirectly a reference to Jezebel, loosely. The film Basic Instinct has the character Catherine Trammell, a seductive and intelligent murder suspect, and she embodies traits commonly associated with Jezebel. So she's got this unapologetic sexuality and manipulation, and that echoes what we're told about Jezebel, especially if you go back to the Middle Ages, where her sexuality was kind of pushed a little bit to make her this sort of villain. And you know by now that I'm a huge bookworm, so we couldn't not talk books here. And modern literature often revisits Jezebel as a more nuanced and complex character, and sometimes reframe her story completely to critique societal views on women. So for instance, there's Jezebel, the untold story of the Bible's harlot queen by Leslie Hazelton in 2007. And this book reinterprets Jezebel as a powerful and progressive figure who resisted patriarchal domination. And I would 100% recommend that you go and read that. I haven't read the whole thing yet, but I did read quite a bit of it this last week, and it is a really good book. So put that on your list. We'll add it to the Ladies of Law book club. And there's also The Red Tent by Anita Diamant, which was written in 1997. And although it's not directly about Jezebel, it does revisit biblical women to explore their agency and resilience, and it looks at it through a feminist lens. So it does definitely resonate with Jezebel's legacy of being unfairly judged by patriarchal narratives. And aside from this, there are numerous academic journals such as Feminist Studies in Religion that explore Jezebel's portrayal in scripture and its implications for understanding female leadership and sexuality. And a lot of these things are available online, so I would 100% recommend that you go and check those out if you're captured and interested by what I've told you today in the podcast. And we also see this changing narrative and different explorations of Jezebel's character in the world of art. And artists have used Jezebel's image to explore themes of power, resistance, and morality. And perhaps one of the most notable examples of this is Kehinde Wiley's portraiture. And Wiley's works feature powerful black women in regal poses, and it helps to reframe traditional narratives around figures like Jezebel. So by placing marginalised figures in positions of power, Wiley challenges societal norms. And it also works as a way of reclaiming the word Jezebel in the context of black women. And Jezebel also appears in various modern online spaces, and her image is used both critically and humorously. So you might remember Jezebel.com, which got taken down, I think, at the end of 2023, and then about a month later it got bought and it got back up again, so it's definitely still there because I went on it the other day. But this is a prominent feminist website which aimed to reclaim Jezebel's name, and the site critiques societal double standards and highlights how women are vilified for exhibiting ambition, confidence, and sexuality. But for all of this reclaiming of the narrative, you know that Jezebel is still there in political commentary, in political rhetoric, and women in positions of power are occasionally still labelled as Jezebels to demean them. But critics do usually challenge this as a misogynistic and reductive term. So hopefully we will see that term slowly dwindle away and not be used anymore in that context. Jezebel remains a potent and polarising force in modern times, whether as a symbol of defiance, a critique of misogyny, or a cautionary tale. Her story resonates across media, art, literature, and feminist discourse. While many modern interpretations seek to reclaim and reframe the narrative, others perpetuate her traditional vilification, reflecting ongoing societal struggles with power, gender, and morality. Thank you so much for joining me on another episode of Ladies of Law. I really enjoyed this one, but I will say I haven't been able to cover everything about Jezebel because she is such a fantastically interesting character. So please do feel free to go to the links in the show notes and have a read through and do a little bit more research of your own if this is something that you're interested in. And let me know what you think, either in the comments or over on Blue Sky. My username is in the show notes. I love talking to you guys, so please do message me anytime you like. I'll be back next week to unravel another thread in the rich tapestry of women in mythology and folklore. Until then, have a lovely week, and I'll speak to you very soon.